Peace, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of HBR. Before we dive into this new episode, we have a bit of housekeeping to do. As you know, Hypebeast Radio launched well over a year ago as just one single show. Today, that one show has successfully grown into an entire platform. Now dubbed Hype Radio, we currently have 3 podcast series. This show, the OG original and flagship show, HBR, as well as Soundcheck, our music-centric series hosted by my fellow long hair don't care brother Manny, and of course Business of Hype with the culture junkie Jeff Staple. Together, we form Hype Radio. So now this is where your part comes in. As you might have noticed, currently by subscribing to Hypebeast Radio or Hype Radio, you're getting all 3 shows. Well, now we're going to separate them so that you can choose what shows you want to subscribe to. And with each offering their own distinct insight, we definitely suggest all 3. So if you're currently subscribed to Hypebeast Radio or Hype Radio, we will soon only serve you Business of Hype. If you want to keep getting HBR and Soundcheck, you'll need to subscribe to them individually. Now, like right now, because you never know who's going to stop by the office and chop it up. So whether you're on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, search HBR, Soundcheck, and Business of Hype to subscribe today. Now that is out of the way, today's episode welcomes Cole Cuchna, the host of Spotify's insanely popular and insanely immersive podcast, Dissect. If you're somehow unfamiliar, Dissect is a serialized music podcast that highlights one album per season, analyzing the meaning, social context, and purpose of one song per episode. With 3 seasons in the bag already, examining contemporary classics like To Pimp a Butterfly, My Dark Twisted Fantasy, and Blonde, Cole is currently rolling out season 4, which dives into the life of Miss Lauryn Hill and her iconic 1998 LP, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. So for this episode, we not only talk about Dissect's new season, but also how Cole was able to turn a passion project into a full-fledged career, where his love for music began, and so much more. Finally, after you give this episode a listen, be sure to subscribe to Dissect on Spotify, as new shows air every Tuesday. So without further ado, this is episode 59 of HBR with Cole Cuchna. Today we have Cole Cuchna, who is the host of Spotify's Dissect podcast. Again, thank you for joining us today, Cole.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I mean, this is probably a pretty crazy time for you. I mean, I say thanks for joining us, not just because you're a host of a insanely popular podcast right now, but because you're expecting your second child pretty much any moment now. Is that right?
Yeah, we're just waiting for the contractions to start. We had a false start yesterday. Thought it was happening yesterday. Wasn't happening yesterday. So definitely on edge, until it happens. But I'm excited for that. But yeah, it's pretty hectic right now.
Yeah, I mean, you must be on cloud 9 right now between the success of your show and then, expanding your family out, right?
Yeah, I think it's exciting, but like any success, it's like comes with its, you're just busier and there's more to manage, and it's good. It's a good busy, but it's still somewhat chaotic, which is to be expected, I guess.
Totally. So before we even dive into Dissect, what it is, and again, those successes and accomplishments, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Actually, let's go all the way back. Where did your love for music start?
Yeah, I think, it's hard. I don't have a great memory in terms of like when I was younger, but as long as I can remember, music has been pretty much the focal point of my life. My earliest memories of my childhood are of my dad like blasting the Beatles while he cleaned the house on weekends. And, I started playing music when I was 12 or 13. I got a guitar for Christmas, and literally ever since then, my life has been about music in some way, shape, or form. So I played in bands for, since I was 14 to, I would say 28 was when I left my last band. So that was, primarily my musical experience was, I call it popular music. I was self-taught for the majority of that time, and I was playing, contemporary music. And then I went to college for music composition, which really kind of changed my view on music. I studied classical music, which I had not studied or even listened to up until I went to college, and this was in my mid 20s. And so I really fell in love with composition and classical music. But I also had this experience in contemporary music, and I loved that as well. So I experienced while I was going to college that those two musical worlds were separated. It was like this kind of education based scholarly approach to music, and then there was like this more popular contemporary approach to music. And it was kind of confusing to me why those two worlds were so separate. And I think, not to kind of get ahead of myself, but that's kind of why Dissect was created, was an attempt to bridge those two worlds together.
Dissect is very analytical. I mean, there's a ton of research that is involved in each episode, each season. Where did this love for or affinity for research, for being overly analytical, come from? Is this something, were you one of those kids that were, hey, I'll take a research paper over a test any day, or was it something that you kind of developed in college?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a college thing. I found myself, I guess I would say, more passionate than most people when it came to like research papers. I'd be like the one that would be really excited about it, get started on like the first day, rather than procrastinating like everyone else, like the final couple of days. So that was interesting to me. And I guess I didn't really think about it too much then, but now looking back, it was definitely something unique in me that I like that kind of stuff, which it appeared that a lot of people did not. So, yeah, I kind of took that approach. And I really loved, I guess what I came out of college with was I had never spent a good amount of time with one piece of work until college. So, we would get I wrote a paper on Beethoven's Third Symphony. And to write that paper, I had to research not only Beethoven's life, not only listen to that symphony over and over and kind of dissect the score and all that, but I also had to research what was going on at the time when he wrote that piece, politically, socially, historically, and because all that stuff kind of worked itself into the music. I kind of really loved that approach, and just spending a lot of time with one piece of art allowed me to gain things, as an education, just kind of through the lens of this great work of art. And that's kind of the approach I've kind of tried to do with Dissect, is let's not only analyze the music, but all the factors that went into creating this piece of music, and also the lessons that we can learn from this piece of music. So yeah, it was definitely influenced by my college experience.
Then after college, right, you were a creative director at a roasters company. I think that's pretty fascinating here. Definitely a switch up from everything you've already said and what we're going to be talking about a little later. What was that like? How did you get that gig? What were you actually doing?
Yeah, so I started working at a specialty coffee shop when I was in college, just as as you do when you're in college. And I really fell in love genuinely with the specialty coffee world. And so I guess like anything that I like, I end up like obsessing over. And
Okay.
coffee became one of those things. So like I was researching like the best way to make coffee, and then the history behind coffee, and just really fell in love with it. So I kind of progressed from just operating the register to barista to then running the training department. And I also had skills in like marketing and social media. And so I basically just took that over at the company. And by the end, I was, creative director, which just meant social media, website marketing, branding, like all the aesthetic, helped design some of the stores. Just using like my creative, I guess my creative side definitely ended up being the focal point of that job. But, I also had this like strange love of coffee as well. So it's just kind of a natural progression there. And, I worked that job until or after I got out of college, just because you come out of college with a music degree. And if you're not going to continue your education, which I almost did, there's not a crazy amount of options for you. So it was like I liked that job, and I just kind of continued to do it. And a few years after college, I started Dissect, and that's when things kind of started to change.
You briefly mentioned earlier why you started to dissect, or what was the reason you bridge those two worlds together. But can you take us back to that time when you really just sat down and was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start this research. I'm going to do a podcast. Like what made you dive into it and just switch up careers that way, or start this hobby?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely started as a hobby. I think, the kind of conception of it was, frankly, just I didn't have anything creative going at that time, aside from my job. I wasn't in a band anymore, and I was outside of college, and so I wasn't composing like I was in college, and so I just didn't really have anything going on, and I didn't really want to do the band thing again. I had written and released a solo project, but I realized with that I didn't really care about performing live anymore, or going on tour, or even trying to make it in the music world. So it kind of just stemmed from, not having anything creative, and just being kind of bored, and I guess not having anywhere for my creative energy to go. So it was kind of like when I think back, like the idea was pretty organic, but after analyzing how it was created, it definitely came from a few specific events in my life. So I just had my first child, Mabel, around that time, and in the beginning stages of having a kid, it's like all they do is sleep and eat most of the time, and so I'd always have like podcasts going on in the background, because it was a great way to just kind of not be watching TV or anything stimulating, but just like have something going while she was sleeping or whatever. So I really fell in love with the podcast format. Kendrick Lamar's "To Pimp a Butterfly" had come out the day after my daughter was born, and so I have this very vivid memory of me sitting with her in her room the day that we got home, holding her in my arms and listening to that album on headphones while while the sun was coming up. It was like this really great moment. And so that album really had an effect on me, and it continued to have an effect on me as I kept listening to it. And the more I listened to it, the more I realized had this narrative. It was trying to say something. And I knew that the only way that I was going to fully receive the message of that album was if I sat down and did what I used to do in college, and just go over every line, research Kendrick's life, research, the events of his life, research Compton, where he's from, all these things that I used to do in college. I was like, well, why don't I just do that, but, apply it to a contemporary album? And so I had the podcast thing. So I was like, well, I can just do it as a podcast. That'd be cool. And it's easy, and I don't have to show my face. I can just record it like casually. And so it was kind of just checked all the boxes. And one other thing I'll mention is, when I went to college, I didn't really know how to read music. I had no formal education at all. And these are the things that you really need when you're like studying music at a collegiate level. And most of my classmates were, they had been in high school band, and they'd taken lessons for years. And so this was like a natural progression for them. For me, I kind of snuck my way into the music program by auditioning with a piece that I composed. So it kind of hid the fact that I didn't know how to read music. But once I got into college, like I realized, oh yeah, I'm going to really need to know how to read music. And I had like literally no education, formal. So I found they're called the Great Courses, and and they're essentially college level classes that you can download. And they're taught by like world famous professors. It's still around, but it's like kind of like podcasts before podcasts were big. It was just like an audio course. They're like, say it was like one subject could be the symphonies of Beethoven, and you download a 16 lecture course and take them on your own time, not for credits or anything. So the way that I augmented my lack of education was I basically downloaded every music course that the Great Courses offered, and was taking those classes while I was also taking like 20 units of, real college classes. And I really loved the format of these Great Courses. It was, like I said, it was one subject, and then you would download 16 to 20 lectures on this single subject that were 30 to 40 minutes long. And so I was like, well, I want to do Kendrick Lamar's "To Pimp a Butterfly." I want to publish it as a podcast, and why don't I just format it almost exactly like these Great Courses? And so that's kind of all the pieces of the puzzle that formed Dissect. Was a podcast, one subject, over, a long period of time. 22 episodes was the first season, and all the episodes were about 30 minutes long. And so that's how everything came together.
So, in asking a lot of my colleagues or friends, what should I talk to Cole about? Because a lot of people listen to Dissect. They have been through from the beginning with Kendrick, especially Frank. I mean, everybody wants to listen to understand what Frank is talking about.
Yeah.
But a lot of us also have gotten our start in our current careers because we were doing that part-time for a while. We were doing it as a hobby, just because we couldn't afford to jump right into it, whether it be monetary or, we didn't have the time and so on. So I want to know, how were you able to balance being a creative director at a brand, having a family life, and then also doing this massive undertaking of a side project?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good question. And it's something that in retrospect that I could definitely think about a lot. And just because I guess at the time it was just something that I was doing and I didn't realize how crazy it was until like the end. But, I would say generally speaking, it was just a lot of long hours. I would go to work for 9 to 10 hours a day. I would come home, spend time with my family. And then when they went to bed, I would work on the podcast. I also, towards the end, I was waking up at like 5 a.m. also on top of that to work on the podcast before family got up, before I had to go to work. And so I guess in general, time management was just like optimize every spare minute that you have, even if that means lack of sleeping. And I don't know if that works for everyone, but I'm a little bit older. I was, early 30s when I started Dissect. And so I had already established a family and already established kind of a career that I could have continued on with. But, I was a creative and I had this, creative yearning. So I think more than anything, it was just the belief in the project. It was, I guess, my natural intuition to like do whatever I need to do to make it happen. And for me, that meant sacrificing sleep, and that meant, putting in the 20 to 30 hours per episode that was needed to make it as best, as good as I could make it. So I think more than anything, it was just one, I loved doing it and I couldn't see myself not doing it. Two, I really ended up believing in the idea, and I would hear from listeners that were listening at, during season one, even though my, following wasn't crazy high at that time, it was like the people that it resonated with, it really, really resonated with. And I was getting emails that were really moving, and I can tell that the podcast is really having an effect on people. So, my own belief in the project and then hearing others that it was resonating with was enough for me to continue on to season two, which is when the season really took off, or the show really took off. And had I just stopped at season one, I wouldn't be doing Dissect for a living. So it was essentially like a year and a half sacrifice of sleep and any free time at all. I stopped watching TV. I stopped going to movies. I stopped doing literally everything but working, spending time with my family, and working on Dissect. That's all I did for about a year and a half to 2 years. But in retrospect, it was like, well, that's nothing compared to now me doing this for a living and getting paid to do it. Like, that is insane to me. And so the 2 years or whatever it was is crazy worth it. So more than anything, more than time management, is just dedication and making it happen by any means necessary.
Right. I read a recent interview with you, I think maybe from earlier this year, where you said, I'm pretty sure it was you, where you said art gives you what you give in. So I imagine that you're still feeling that today then, right?
Yeah, I think the quote something like, yeah, art gives, I can't remember what something, it was something like that. Yeah, art gives you what you give it. Okay. And I think the message behind that was, there's these incredible works of art, not only in music, but in film and print and poetry. And, these things take artists years and years and years to create. And the really good ones can change your life, but you have to give yourself to it. And I always, I'm kind of living proof of what that can do. Not only me doing Dissect for a living, that's one thing, but I think more importantly is like the kind of philosophical or spiritual or intellectual like meanings that you can get from these works, and they can literally change how you see the world, and how you move in the world, and therefore they change your life. Like for me, season one of Dissect on Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly literally changed my life, and it has nothing to do with like what I do for a living. Studying that work, studying Kendrick's story, studying, you know, systemic racism and all these things that I'd kind of always heard about, but never really did the research to know exactly what those things are. Like doing that work changed how I viewed the world. It changed how I like I interacted with people, and it literally changed like my how I move in the world and how the decisions that I make. And so I've kind of come to like treat art and music specifically as like scripture almost, and it's like I approach it as if someone is like reading the Bible looking for to find meaning in their life or how to like navigate themselves in the world. Like that's the way I'm looking at these great pieces of art. And if you approach art in that way and you give it your time, it's insane what it gives back to you. And I think in a culture where we're streaming, a bunch of music, there's like, 8 records that drop every Friday that, you have to listen to. It just can get really overwhelming. And I think there needs to be a space and a mindset that counters that in some way, where it's like, no, for the great works of art, we're still going to give it our time, and we're going to dedicate, maybe not. I mean, I'm an insane example. That takes me like 300 hours to analyze one album. But I think even if you just sat down and listened to the album without driving, without anything else, is just sit down and listen to an album in headphones, maybe a couple times over a course of a couple weeks or something, like, dedicate some time to these works that are already drawing you in. I always say there's a reason why a great work, or there's a reason why your favorite album is your favorite, or there's a reason why you listen to, I don't know, Blonde, 5 times a week. It's like it's trying to tell you something, and you're never going to fully realize what it's trying to tell you until you actually give it, a dedicated, not just passive listening, but dedicate some time to trying to figure out what that is. And it's amazing what it can give it back, what it'll give back to you.
And could you tell us a little bit about your research process? Like you said, you just said spending 300 hours for one series or on one album. Can you offer just a little bit of insight of like what that process is like for you? Or are you just sitting in a cave somewhere with just massive headphones on and just listening and just writing?
Yeah, I think, well, the most of the time is just the research part. And that's just, the interesting thing about doing contemporary works is that there's no like books or like really any written material on it. So it's just a lot of Google searching, to be honest. And so it's just browsing the web. And I guess the biggest thing is just allowing yourself to go down the rabbit hole. Like if there's a line in a song, like I always use, 40 acres and a mule comes up in Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. And it's like, well, okay, I've heard that phrase, but what does it really mean? And what's the history behind how that phrase came about? And then you end up going, not only researching the meaning of 40 acres and a mule, but also like, the liberation of slaves or of slavery. And then also, okay, well, what was the beginning of slavery and how does that tie in? And then what was the effects of 40 acres and a mule? And, how is that resonating even still today? It's like, so on this one line in one song, I could research like 4 hours, easily. And so that's where the time really comes in, is just like making sure you're seeing all the threads all the way through and not kind of like just half-assing doing surface level research. And so I think that's the bulk of it. Like, and it's also a lot of listening and writing, but I would say just like following those threads is the biggest time consuming thing. And that's the fun part for me, because you just never know where you're going to end up. You just kind of start going on one thing, and then it's like all of a sudden you're in a whole other area, but it relates, and you're able to tie all these like disparate things together.
Were you falling into moments often where you're falling down that rabbit hole and just getting lost and or just getting sidetracked looking at, before you know it, you're looking at YouTube videos of dogs and cats or something? Or
Yeah.
or how do you prevent that? I mean, because that's exactly what I would be doing, I'm not gonna lie. But how do you prevent that from happening? And because again, you're already spending excuse my swearing, you're already spending a fuck ton of hours on this. So how do you
Yeah.
keep it narrowed and focused?
Yeah, I think um it's hard for me because I think that just comes naturally. I hate wasting time. So if I find myself wasting time and if it's not purposeful, sometimes I'll waste time on purpose because you need that every once in a while. But I'm pretty good at just like zeroing in and like staying focused. I guess the hard part is like sometimes you can go overboard. And so that's where if I do get too far down the rabbit hole and I'm just reading about something that I know just now doesn't relate at all to the work, I'll usually just like backtrack a second and be like, okay, where am I? And just kind of reset.
Right.
But I think in general, it's just kind of like, I think my natural inclination towards getting shit done is really helps because I don't have time to waste is the thing. So if I find myself wasting time, like it's just time I don't have. So and then it ends up eating like biting me in the ass later on because that's an hour I could have spent doing something else, something productive towards Dissect. And especially back in the day when I only had a very certain amount of hours to work on it, that's a huge deal. So a lot of it was just necessity or is still necessity.
So getting out of back of the day, right? Or sort of. Season 1 you said was a bit slow. Season 2 took off. I mean, I think I've read that like your viewership grew massively. In season 2 with Kanye, of course, right?
Yeah.
And then you landed a deal with Spotify, which they're sponsoring and hosting your show now. Can you tell us what that process was like? How, was it something, Spotify reached out to you, or was it the other way around? How was this, kind of this deal exchanged, and what were you going through in your life at that time?
Yeah, it was insane time for me personally. Season 2 definitely just exploded out of nowhere. Kanye helps, obviously, that's a big magnetic kind of character. And I hopefully the show was more polished than the first season. I really tried to like, hone my craft more and kind of really polish it up for the second season. So I think and then it had some momentum coming from season 1. So all the kind of cards aligned, and season 2 was pretty successful. And I also got lucky that podcasting is so hot right now, and so
no kidding.
There was so there was like the show hopefully is good. Kanye is a magnetic subject, and also there's a lot of people just looking to get involved in podcasts. So I had a number of people approach me throughout season 2. Interested in doing something with Dissect. I guess like nothing really felt right, even though it was like really exciting. It was like getting all this interest and publications were writing about it. It was like nothing was coming along that was like, okay, well, for me, it was like, I have to quit my job. There's no way season 3 can exist without me quitting my job because it was just becoming too exhausting and too hard on my family and all that. So I was really just waiting for, something to come along that I could just quit my job and do Dissect full time. And the funny thing looking back is like I actually said that on air after every episode in season 2 was like, I'm working full time. I want to do Dissect full time. So, leave at that point, it was like, leave a review, tell a friend, help me spread the show. But I think just putting that in the world, like really helped for whatever reason. Well, I know the reason. When I got the call from Spotify, I talked to Courtney Holt, who had just took over as the lead on Spotify original production. So everything but music. So video and getting into podcasts, he's kind of now overseeing. And he said, the first thing he said to me was like, I heard at the end of your shows, you said you want to do this full time. And I think I can make that happen for you. Wow. And so when I talked to Courtney, like within 30 seconds of talking to him, I knew it was the one. I just had the feeling like, okay, this is it. I believed Courtney's vision for, Spotify's production and his vision for podcasting and what they wanted to do. They also allowed me to quit my job. I actually work for Spotify now as like a salary position to produce Dissect, which is like insane and unheard of. And so I got really lucky there. And also the big thing for me was like, I wanted to, maintain creative control, and they offered, they still to this day allow me to do essentially anything that I want. So all the things kind of aligned with Spotify, that it was just the perfect fit. And the whole music thing obviously is a huge connection. And, you know, hopefully in the future, we're working on utilizing kind of their artist resources to hopefully that I can actually talk to these artists and do all that. So I would say like overall, it was crazy, like stressful, trying to figure out the best right move to like to take this to the next level, not screw it up. I mean, it was like the most stressful time of my life. It ended up being the best thing that happened, but like it's really hard, like to know, on top of working full time and taking care of a family, then you're now trying to make this huge career move and not screw it up. It was like insanely stressful, but good results. Good in the end, worked out really great.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I imagine making a switch over to Spotify, doing this full time has affected you and your family life, your personal life a great deal, giving you a bit more time. But how has, if any, if at all, has the Spotify partnership affected Dissect?
I mean, the biggest thing is time. I literally wake up and work on Dissect, 8-9 hours a day now. And hopefully, that means hopefully the content's better. There's more content. I have resources at Spotify that help with, we were able to do song recreations for season 3, which we hadn't done in the past. We got original theme music. We got, some stuff that I just didn't have the finances for before. So that's one thing as well. But I think more than anything, it's just time. And hopefully in the future, we're working on actually, work again, like I said, talking to the artists and including their voice on the show. We tried that for season 3, but of course, Frank is pretty notorious for not doing anything in terms of like interviews or whatever. So it's like I picked the hardest person to actually get, and that's all good. That's Frank, and that's that's how he moves, and that's cool. And I knew that going in. But hopefully in the future we're able to get these people on the show and have them talk directly to me and about the work. And I think I could ask them questions that not a lot of people would ask, just because I'm, spending so much time with their work. It's a conversation I'm really looking forward to making happen.
Have you received any feedback from some of your different subjects, Kendrick, Kanye, and as you mentioned, Frank, whether it be from them directly or maybe from their camp or their friends or acquaintances?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to Frank's management team more towards the beginning of the series, but they had listened, and Frank had listened to at least the first 1 or 2 episodes. The best thing was that they didn't really have a problem with it, and they just allowed us to do it. So to me, that was enough to be like, okay, they listened, and they're not like redlining it at all.
Right.
So
they don't hate it.
Yeah, that was good enough feedback for me. For seasons 1 and 2, I was doing those on my own, so definitely not during the creation. I didn't hear from them at all. Since then, I have definitely heard certain, I don't know how much is true or whatever, but I know TDE knows of the podcast at least, and I know Kanye himself knows of the podcast. Whether they listen, I don't know, but
yeah, Kanye West knows everything that's on the internet of him.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's cool. Like that stuff's cool, but it's not really why I do it. So it's kind of just like, I don't know. It's just something, a fun fact or something, but like, that's not why I'm doing the podcast. Is not to like for them. I mean, it is for them, but it's like I feel like they aren't the most important people that should be hearing it. I think it's, more of the everyday listener.
And for those listeners, right? What do you say to those listeners that give you a bit of backlash for trying to self-analyze what these artists are saying or trying to convey? 'Cause I imagine some people think that, where it's like, hey, just let it be their art, don't try to decipher what they're saying. Do you get that often or sometimes? And then what do you say to them?
No, I mean, not, I would think there would be more of that, but there's not. And I think that has less to do with, well, I would say it this way. If someone doesn't like the show, they don't have to listen. Like, they literally just turn it off. So I mostly hear people that are like buy into the show. And so the feedback I get from people is mostly positive. Um, because again, like the people that don't like it just turn it off and they don't think and they don't think about it again. Um, unless they have a real problem with it and then they can email me or whatever. But I feel like that's kind of what happens. I'd say the most about I guess two negative feedbacks that come up sometimes is one, someone will have like a disagreement about what I've said specifically about one line. They'll say, love the show, but I thought this about this line. And that's totally cool. Like usually I tried, at least in my head, I tried to separate my personal opinion I'll usually preface it with something like, you know, I think this or it seems to be this if I'm not like entirely sure. But because I've done so much research, I feel like pretty justified in the things that I put in. And there's a lot of stuff that I leave out that is speculation that just doesn't make the show because I don't think it's grounded on anything or enough. And so what I put in is usually pretty thoughtful in terms of like it's grounded on something. And I guess there was some feedback. Well, I wouldn't say a lot at all, but there's definitely like some people that issue with like a white person dissecting, especially like Kendrick Lamar's "To Pimp a Butterfly," dissecting an album like that. And I even had that kind of own negative. That was definitely a big like question before I even started Dissect first season. Was like, who am I to like dive so deeply into this work and like try to tell this story or at least explain it or whatever, because I'm not from Compton. I'm not African American. I'm a white kid from the suburbs, essentially. That was definitely a battle that I had to go through in my own, just personally, before I even started the show. But the conclusion that I came up with, and this is what I tell people that for anyone or the few that would say something along those lines, is like, one, I'm not and I don't try to position myself as the end all be all. Two, how I justified it was, well, like, why not me? Like, here's this incredible album telling me something about something that I really have no idea about. One position would be to turn my back on it and walk away because I don't feel like it's for me. But to me, then I don't learn anything. It's like the other option is, yeah, I'll spend 300 hours researching this person, this album, this environment, this history, and I'm going to come out the other side much more educated on the subject than I started with. And what better way to do it than through music, which is something that I love. And as long as I do that honestly and don't try to inject my personal thoughts or feelings into keep it journalistic, I just didn't really see the problem with it. It was a huge, like I said earlier, it was like a huge learning experience for me, and it literally changed my life. And I would not, looking back at it now, like the decision was 100% correct for me personally. Whether like someone wants to listen or not, that's another thing. But knowing what I know now, and knowing the way that it changed the way I looked at the world, like I would not take that back for like anything. So that's, I guess, my answer to some of the criticism that could come up. But overall, it's generally received well, at least what I hear.
With season 3, you had the mysterious, as you said, Frank Ocean. Season 4 is equally mysterious artist is Lauryn Hill.
Yep.
And that just launched last week, correct?
Yeah, last week on all platforms. The week before on Spotify.
Okay.
But yeah, it's on all platforms now.
Okay. And what did you learn in this season? Maybe about Lauryn Hill, or how was the process different leading up to this season? Again, now this being your second season at Spotify.
Well, one thing we did this year was I hired a research assistant. So a lot of the legwork comes in the beginning stages, where it's like literally just like a month of preliminary research, researching Lauryn herself, researching the time, the history, where things were culturally, blah, blah, blah. So I had someone do a lot of that stuff for me in the beginning, which was a huge, huge help. And it was, I don't think I sacrificed content. I was able to, essentially what he did His name's Akash. Shout out Akash. But he essentially went through like 30 sources and put together these really organized kind of condensed version of all these sources, and he organized it by time and all this stuff. So essentially I got to sit down and go through these really, really well organized documents and expedite, at least a month's work of research. And I was able to just get started right away. So that was really helpful this season, just from a production standpoint. I guess content wise, this season's different because I'm going back in history 20 years. The first 3 seasons all within the last, I guess, Twisted Fantasy's now, 8 years old now? But pretty recent work. This is the furthest back that I've gone, which is 20 years. So that was definitely different, just kind of like getting a sense of where things were culturally. Was harder because I wasn't quite, we're not living it as closely as I am with like Blonde, for instance, where I can actually still feel like what's going on now when the album was written. So that was different. And I think Lauryn Hill is just such a, I guess, yeah, her story is so unique, starting from a childhood actor, actress, singer, very successful at a very young age. And then everything that happens afterwards is, shrouded in mystery, but I think that's still kind of a very interesting part of her legacy. And then, there's this kind of diamond in the rough, which is miseducation that happens in the middle of all that. And it's just like this timeless, incredible album. And I guess the question that I was asking myself was like, this is, a bona fide classic on, anyone that knows what they're talking about considers this a classic album. But I was why is it a classic? What makes a classic album? Like, what are the components that, make a classic album? And that was a question that was kind of underlying the whole process. And so that was really interesting to kind of try to figure out. And it was actually, I was less familiar with this album than I was with the past albums. I had listened to it, but definitely not with like the scrutiny that I did the last 3. So it was kind of fun to just like dive into not a new album, but something that I wasn't 100% familiar with before.
So we have episodes rolling out weekly, correct?
Yeah, every Tuesday.
Every Tuesday. Okay. What else is next for Dissect? What's in the pipeline? I see that you guys do merch. You did a book in the past for the Kendrick Lamar series, and you've done some charity events as well in the past. Where else do you see Dissect going?
Yeah, I think at this point it's just continuing seasons. I guess the big decision that I had to make was like whether I'd stick to hip hop or branch out in genres. It sounds like the best thing right now is to stay in hip hop for a number of reasons, but we're also thinking about kind of franchising it, maybe starting a couple other spin-off shows that do tackle other genres but with the same approach. So I think generally speaking, it's about how do we extend the Dissect brand? Do we do a live show component at some point? Do we maybe try to turn it into a visual series at some point? We have this brand of Dissect and this kind of process, but what are all the iterations of that process? And how can we spread the show and make it as big as possible and kind of make it, my goal is that it becomes like one of the most prestigious, critical analysis that we have in the world, I guess. So that's kind of my big picture view of it, is how do we spread Dissect outside of the podcast format, or at least expand it within, and get, diversify its genres and its kind of output formats. So we're working on that kind of stuff, but short-term focus is of course season 4, and all that other stuff is kind of stuff we're just still figuring out.
Has season 4 already been like recorded all the way through?
No, I haven't even started.
No.
I think I figured out who's next, but that won't drop until like spring of 2019.
Could you give us a hint at all who might be next?
If you follow me on social media, I usually sprinkle in some hints here and there. So I'll say that.
Shout out those handles though.
Yeah. Oh yeah. At Dissect Podcast on all the shits.
Easy enough. All right. And do you have any last bit of advice for? Again, I think you gave some great advice for turning a hobby and a passion project into your career and your full-time gig. But do you have any advice for anybody that's looking to start a podcast or has something to say and wants to get it out there in the open for other people to hear?
Yeah, I mean, my advice is always just like do the work. Just do it. Like I hear people pitch me ideas all the time, and they're usually really good ideas, and I'll check in a couple months later or whatever the case may be, and they just haven't done anything, and I'm just like, what are you waiting for? Like I feel like that's half the battle. More than half the battle is just like executing the idea, whatever that means. Just put the pen to paper or whatever your idea is. Just get started on it. Don't think too hard about it, because once you get into the process, like you can speculate about whatever you want, and it's easy to do that forever, and then it becomes like this huge like roadblock to like even getting started, as all as this speculation of what could happen and all that. Like I'm a big advocate of just getting your hands dirty from day one, just starting on it, because there will be problems and things that arise that you just never even realized that you would know to speculate. So and once you actually start to do the work, you realize that it's in, most of the time it's within your skill set and your capability to actually do it. And again, that's going to like allow you to see the process through, rather than getting in your own head and speculating about everything that could happen before you even start the first thing. So again, big advocate of just doing the work. And if you believe in the idea, just, it's going to take sacrifice, but if you believe in it enough, the sacrifice, at least in my case, was 100% worth it. So just get started. Whatever you want, whatever you're thinking about doing, just do the damn thing.
There it is. Cole, thanks for coming or joining us on this call today. Do you want to quickly give a quick run through where people can listen, how they tune in, when they're available?
Yeah, so you can listen on Spotify, is obviously the platform of choice. We drop episodes a week earlier on Spotify. We also have great bonus episodes that are only on Spotify. We window it there a week, so you can find it on other podcast platforms a week later. So yeah, you can listen wherever you're comfortable, but definitely check it out on Spotify. And we're gonna have a lot of cool, exciting things only on Spotify next year. So and the podcast experience is getting really good on Spotify, so I definitely check it out there. But other than that, yeah, follow at Dissect Podcast on all the socials, and yeah, man, that's it.
Fire. Again, thank you for joining us again, Cole and Hypebeast. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.
Cool. Thanks, man.